Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the Alda Center for our November webinar, Storytelling with Data, Building Knowledge Through Visualizations. I would like to thank the Kavli Foundation for sponsoring this webinar. My name is Claire Holzowski, and I am the Science Communication Specialist at the Allen Alda Center for Communicating Science. And in case if you are less familiar with us, the work that we do at the Alda Center is about empowering scientists, medical professionals, and researchers to communicate their work clearly and vividly to all audiences. Just before we begin, I have a couple quick logistics. As you can see, we are using the webinar format in Zoom. And as the conversation unfolds today between our awesome panelists and moderator, please put your questions for them using the Q&A function. And towards the end, we will be able to answer as many questions as possible. If you are having any technical troubles, please reach out to me and I will be the one to assist you as best as I can. And this webinar is also being recorded, and it is currently now streaming on our YouTube channel. And so if you do need to exit the webinar at any time, it will be available for you to watch at a later date. And with that, I am going to turn things over to my colleague, Nico.
Hi, Claire. Thank you so much for the introduction. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar on data visualization. My name is Nicolas Wigenhauser, and I'm a PhD candidate at Stony Brook University and also a trainee of the Science Communication Certificate Program here at the Alda Center. It is my absolute pleasure to moderate today's session. So as a researcher in the field of evolutionary neuroscience, I can say that we humans, like the rest of primates, are visual animals. Everything comes first visually, from the clothes you choose to wear to the dish you order at a restaurant. Information is the exact same thing and must be visually conveyed in a functionally and sophisticated fashion. Also, for the first time in human history, we are creators and users of an immense amount of information. Therefore, there is currently a strong and urgent need for communicators that specialize in effective and appealing visual communication. Data visualization is defined as the translation of information into a visual context to make data more accessible to our brains to understand. The main goal here is to make it easier to identify patterns, trends, and outliers in massive datasets. Like the rest of the disciplines within science communication, data visualization in particular seeks to identify, manipulate, format, and deliver data in the most efficient way possible. This field is actually radically transforming the way modern societies interact with data and also provides a fast, effective way to communicate complex information in a universal manner. Today, we want to publicly talk about the importance of presenting information in a visually appealing and pleasing way. we will talk to Heather Lynch and Daisy Chung about the most effective ways to apply data visualization in our daily work. We also hope to build a bridge and connect scientists, communicators and journalists, and visual and graphic designers. In today's webinar, I will start introducing our speakers, Heather and Daisy. Then they will be sharing with us their fascinating work and inspiring life experiences. After their presentations, we will have plenty of time to have a nice Q&A session, so please feel free to type your questions at any time during this webinar. We will do our best to include as many questions as possible. So let me begin by introducing our distinguished panelists. Dr. Heather Lynch is the Institute for Advanced Computational Sciences Endowed Chair for Ecology and Evolution at Stony Brook University. Her research focuses on the ecology and conservation of Antarctic wildlife, particularly Antarctic penguins, and the development of decision support tools to aid Antarctic policymakers and other stakeholders. Heather is also a National Geographic explorer and recently completed a one-year fellowship through the AAAS Leshner Leadership Institute for Public Engagement with Science and Technology. Heather's work has been reported widely in television, magazines, and newspapers, most recently in this month's issue of National Geographic. When non-modeling penguins, you can find Heather a hunch over her various embroidery and sewing projects. Daisy Chung is an award-winning science visual communicator and illustrator, originally from Taiwan and New Zealand. She currently works as the data visual designer at Sorgo Venture, creating data-driven visual stories to share research findings addressing global health and social issues. She also creates visual-first digital stories for the Climate Solution Desk at the Washington Post. Previously, she was the creative director at WikiHow, former graphics editor at National Geographic, and a freelance science visualization artist. Daisy aims to make complex science more accessible to a broader audience through visual storytelling. Her work has appeared in Scientific American, National Geographic, Cell Press, and various other platforms. When not drawing, you can find Daisy hiking, climbing rocks, harness training her cat, and finding different uses for sourdough starters. So now we will welcome Dr. Lynch to start her section and share her screen. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And today I'm really just going to touch on the tip of the iceberg, but hopefully providing some context for Daisy's talk and the discussion to follow. So as scientists, we often think that the analysis is the hardest part of any project, and the figures that follow, we'll deal with that when we write the paper. But really, as anyone who's been through this cycle knows, the code that plots the figure is often much harder to write than the analysis itself. So lest you think it's not important, I hope that you'll remember that getting the figures right is a huge part of getting your research published. Perhaps even more so than the analysis itself, because the figures are really the public face of your data and your analysis. And moreover, it's an important part of getting your grant funded in the first place. And even if you're not in science, it's an important part of getting your message across. And that's true if you're a real estate agent or a doctor or a politician. Getting the graphics right is really, really important. So we'll touch a bit on how to do that in today's discussion. So when I talk about what does it mean for the figures to look right, I just want to say at the outset that I'm distinguishing between figures that you might make for a scientific publication, really for anything that you would print out on paper, and anything that you would put together for a presentation like today's presentation. So the figures that you would make for print can be highly complex and very data rich, multifaceted, but they are unavoidably static. But they can include a lot more information than what you would use for a presentation, where people may have 30 seconds to absorb that. They have to be quite simple. You need really large fonts, but they can be dynamic as well. One of the biggest mistakes that I see people making is that they'll take a figure that they made for a paper and they'll just slap it into PowerPoint for a presentation. Or they'll take a figure that they made for a presentation and just slap it into a manuscript. But these two outlets are so different that really what you need to do is design a figure that's specifically for one of these two media, and they have very different requirements. So not to pick on any one set of authors, I've not identified the authors of this paper here, and it's actually quite an old paper. But I wanted to start by highlighting some of the mistakes that I see people making. And this figure actually combines a lot of the mistakes that I see people making when they make scientific figures. The first is simply the symbols themselves. Typically, journals would prefer filled symbols. They photocopy better, they print better, they're easier to see. So I would use as your default, solid symbols. That's a pretty easy thing to do. The other, one of my biggest pet peeves is that a lot of the default software that people are using for making figures includes a lot of white space that you're not going to want in your final figure. Space is money when it comes to a manuscript. You want to squeeze as much information as you can. So you want to reduce, for example, the distance between the label and the tick mark labels. It seems kind of silly, but that white space certainly adds up. This particular axis label is in a serif font. Most journals are going to require a sans serif font. Sans serif fonts often work better in an online format and presentations. So my advice is to stick with those sans serif fonts. And we'll talk about journal requirements in a bit. Another one of my really big pet peeves with figures is illustrated here, and the difference between the font size of the number 10 and the font size of the panel letter A. It's just like one of those visual tests, right? Like if you can see the number 10, then the letter A is way too big. And if the letter A is correct, you're never going to see the number 10. So the dynamic range of the fonts that you use in your figure should be pretty small because everything has to be visible. The legend here, having a legend in your plot like this is certainly better than having that information just in the caption. But the whole goal should be to reduce the cognitive load of the person looking at your figure. So in this case, you can see that legend is quite uninterpretable, and it might require you to refer back and forth from the paper to even figure out what I-P1/I-NT1 is. But you often don't even need the legend itself. Sometimes you can just put the label right next to the point in one of those panels and be done with it. So thinking about where to put the legend or even whether to have a legend is an important decision. Finally, again, it seems nitpicky, but oftentimes reviewers are making a snap judgment on your paper. The fact that the panel letters are not symmetric in the corner, it annoys me as a reviewer. So it's a really easy thing to fix, is just to make sure that there's a certain symmetry to that. And finally, the most subtle thing here is that this particular Cohen's d index, you wouldn't know that necessarily, but it essentially represents a ratio. And so anytime that you're plotting a ratio, you have to be very careful, because what happens is that all the values above 0 in this case get stretched out relative to all of the values below 0. So ratios are particularly hard to represent well, because by definition, your plot will favor, a ratio of 2 to 1 over a ratio of 1 to 2. So that's a subtle point, but one that I mentioned because it comes up in this figure. Figures in really high impact papers all share a similar look, and I would really encourage you to look at Science or Nature or other top journals in your field and just see what figures look like. They all have this look, which is extremely information rich, very colorful, lots of panels, a mix of photographs, art, data, maps. It's not just limited to the data itself, but it really combines a number of different elements into the same figure. So look at the top papers in your field and really think about what they all have in common. So I just want to talk briefly about what's in your toolbox. And so people will have a certain toolbox for the data analytics, be that R or Mathematica or Python or MATLAB. And they often think that they need to use the same tools for data visualization. But the tools that you have for data visualization are actually much broader, and you should think about using a broader set of tools for the graphics than you necessarily used for the analysis. So it might include elements that are developed in these programs, but you should also keep in mind the capabilities of Adobe Illustrator or Adobe Photoshop. I'm a huge fan of these products. Adobe sometimes can be hard to love. It's expensive. It requires a subscription now. But nevertheless, I think that for a lot of top quality graphics, it can't be beat. There are some other open source or cheaper versions that do something similar, for example, Inkscape, BioRender, or GIMP. But again, these are ones that, in my opinion, if your focus is really on data visualization, I would invest the time and money into getting good at some of those more professional tools like the Adobe products. A lot of people will make figures in PowerPoint. And I can't stress enough how much I would encourage you to move beyond PowerPoint if you're one of these people. You can certainly make a lot of sophisticated figures in PowerPoint, but it's always going to look like it was made in PowerPoint. Anyone's going to be able to look at that and they're going to recognize the arrowheads, they're going to recognize the fonts. it's just very hard to make it look like anything other than a PowerPoint slide. So I would really encourage people to move beyond that. I'm a huge fan of Creative Market. If you have, 5 or 6 hours to spare, it's a bit of a rabbit hole, but I would encourage you to check it out. You can get icons there, fonts, templates, infographics. You can get elements that would allow you to put together a really nice figure. The Guide of Natural Science Guild, of Natural Science Illustrators is another great resource, as is the Data Visualization Society. And so Daisy's going to actually introduce a lot more tools as well, but the take-home message being that, as I'll come back to, don't be afraid to call in a professional when a professional is really needed. And finally, I just want to highlight these 2 other resources here, Colorgorical and Color Brewer. These are 2 great resources for thinking about a color scheme if you're making a map or another visualization. So just to touch on some of the really basic background of data visualization, color is really important, and you have some choices as to what color scheme to use. Generally, they're divided into these 3 schemes here. You've got a gradient scheme, you've got a divergent scheme, where you have something that's sort of neutral in the middle, and then it goes to, you can think of it as hot and cold on either end. And sometimes you just need a categorical scheme where there is no continuous scale being represented, you just need them to be different. The rainbow color scheme is particularly problematic. There's a lot of research showing that, in particular because the color yellow and the color cyan sort of pop out and create boundaries that might not be appropriate to the analysis or the visualization. Rainbow schemes in general should be avoided, and they are no longer the default in MATLAB, for example, but they do pop up again and again. So again, just a bit of a warning about rainbow color schemes. There's a lot of research on that that you can look into. But I wouldn't overlook grayscale. Grayscale is particularly good for topographic maps. It's a very effective visualization option. So don't think that adding color is always going to make your figure better. That's certainly not the case. I think the human eye can perceive shadows in that kind of grayscale quite well. There's a lot of research on the psychological science behind visualization, and I can't do more than to sort of point at the fact that there is research that you should go look into it if it's of interest. Just one example, in the class that I teach, we read this paper, is looking at, well, if you have 4 different categories, how do I flag category 1 as being important? Maybe it's your control, who knows? Now you could make it fatter, that box plot fatter. You could isolate it by itself. You could color it in gray. You could just point at it with an arrow, or you could use words to say this is important. So all of these may work to greater or lesser degree, depending on the audience. But this is just a shout out to say that there's a lot of psychology behind this. And as a scientist or as a data visualizer, it's good to be aware of what the science says about how people will perceive that figure. So no one should be starting with a blank page, all right? Admire and adapt is the theme here. Go find something online that's about 80% of what you want and just tweak it to be exactly what you need. But there's no excuse now to be starting with a blank page, because there are these galleries out there online where the code is already available to make some really beautiful visualizations. And you might just have to tweak it here or there for your particular data set, but the basic structure of the plot has already been made for you. So don't start with a blank page. If you're writing a paper and you're making figures for a journal, read the instructions for the journal. And then read them again, okay? Because they're going to be very specific about what the journal wants. It's going to say something you can see here in this journal. Use a sans serif font. We prefer Helvetica. If the journal's asking for Helvetica, just use Helvetica. The creativity is not going to be rewarded here. If they say that they want the first letter of a label capitalized, do what they say, right? This is a big part of making sure that your paper looks like something that could be published in that journal. And if you're ever in doubt, just look at a recently published paper in that journal and reverse engineer your figures to have that look. So I just want to share a personal anecdote from my own research. As Nico mentioned, I study Antarctic penguins and how their populations change over time. Sometimes we don't have a lot of information about particular locations, and what we end up with are these really highly uncertain population estimates. So in this case, this site, we're essentially saying, look, we think that there are about 40,000 penguins here, but it could be anywhere from 5,000 to 80,000. Now, we got feedback from the users of this tool that we had developed that said, look, the fact that you even have the line here, the fact that you even specify that 40,000 is the estimate might communicate more certainty than is implied by the confidence intervals. And the scientist in me says, look, we were clear, the confidence intervals are huge, but it doesn't matter if the end user doesn't understand a confidence interval. You have to think about their perception of the data, not literally what the plot says. And so we've been exploring other ways of communicating that uncertainty. And I just show you 3 examples here. You know, this is a different site, but you can see that in our forecast, what you could do would be to plot all the different ensembles. Like any of these blue lines could have happened. Or we can draw samples from that distribution and use dots, overlay dots to represent that uncertainty. Or on the far right side, we can use color to indicate the intensity of support for certain values over other values. So this is very much work in progress, but it's not an easy thing to do because it doesn't matter what is strictly on the page. What matters is how does your reader interpret it. So I just want to end with one anecdote. I've been very lucky over the last 4 or 5 years to be a data science advisor for ProPublica. ProPublica thinks really hard about how to communicate the sort of data science journalism that they do. They have something called the Surgeon Scorecard, which is designed as a decision support tool to help people pick a surgeon. So let's say you need to get knee surgery and you want to find the very best surgeon in your area. What you can do is go to Surgeon Scorecard and you can look for the estimated rate of complications for all the surgeons in your area. Now, there was a huge amount of work that went into this just prior to my joining the data science advisory, and they thought a lot about how to communicate these results to the average person. And even though you have a very, very smart team of people thinking really, really hard about this, they did get quite a bit of criticism, in particular from this Rand Corporation analysis. And one of their concerns was that creating these 3 discrete categories, low, medium, high, meant that trivial changes to a doctor's score would push them from low into medium, for example, and that would lead to unnecessary misclassification. And so you can see that there's this tension between creating something that's like red light, green light, like something really easy for someone to understand, and something that was sort of statistically rigorous or maybe would pass muster in a scientific journal. Those are sometimes in conflict with one another. One of the other studies on this Surgeon Scorecard was a group that took the Surgeon Scorecard to the Minnesota State Fair, and they surveyed 265 adults using 2 different ways of looking at the Surgeon Scorecard data. So in the top is what ProPublica's Surgeon Scorecard outputs now. And then the bottom is, instead of showing sort of a probability density function for that surgeon's rate of complications, it showed the point estimate for that surgeon relative to the point estimates of all the other surgeons in the area. And it turns out that nearly half of the people, adults that were surveyed, would make a different decision if they received the information with the bottom figure rather than the top figure. Now, both of these are perfectly correct. Neither is statistically false. But it just goes to show how difficult it is to communicate this information when you're trying to help someone make a difficult decision. So my final thoughts is that good tools are worth investing in, both time and money. If it costs $3 to buy the perfect arrow on Creative Market, you're going to use that arrow for the rest of your career. Just, it's like cheaper than a cup of coffee. Just buy the arrow, buy the thing that you need for your presentation. I think I spent like $200 putting together my tenure presentation when I went up for tenure. That's a lot of money, but on the other hand, would you spend $200 to get tenure? Like, yes, I think, that was probably a good investment. So you need to invest in your future. That means, doing what you need to buy this little arrowhead or buy this little icon. Don't start from scratch if you can avoid it. Make sure that you leave time to do the visualizations well. Tailor the visualization to the audience. If you're talking to Medicare recipients, it's going to be a different audience than if you're talking to parents, or if you're talking to children, or you're talking to scientists. Those are different audiences. And finally, know when to call in a professional. It is not a failing of yours if you are a scientist and you reach the limit of your abilities and you need someone, be it a data visualization expert or a scientific illustrator, to take it to the next level. And I would say that's particularly true if you're trying to get the cover of a journal. That is especially when I would think need to call in a professional. So with that, I'll just thank you for your time and turn it over to a true professional, Daisy Chung, to talk about what she does.
Well, thank you so much, Heather. Your insight has been really constructive and very, very interesting. So we will move to Daisy now. Please, Daisy, feel free to share your screen, and the floor is all yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nico, for the kind words, and Heather for sharing the great insights. And totally agree that a good-looking arrow is worth $3. Great advice. So I'm gonna share my screen now. Y'all can see. Awesome. So today I'm going to talk about storytelling with data, which is quite a big topic to cover in 15-20 minutes. So I'm going to try to touch on some top level concepts that can hopefully get you started on what I do in data viz, some basic data viz tips and tricks, and then how do we turn data into story, into journalism, then finally end with some resources for aspiring data viz people. So many of the examples that I'm going to show will have a web presence or further reading. So I think Claire dropped in the chat a Google Doc that I created where you can follow all these links along the presentation, as well as dive further to explore later on your time. Yeah. So what do? I have a background in biology and art. And somewhere along the lines, I discovered I can actually combine those two passions and pursued science illustration, which I did for grad school. So now my work kind of scans as a science visual communicator, from cover illustrations like Heather mentioned, to some infographics, more illustrative ones, to all the way to more data-driven work, both in print and in digital, which would be the part that I focus a little bit more on today on data viz. Okay, so let's start from the basics. So you want to make a chart. Where do you start? First, always start by defining what is your point of this chart for your targeted audience. That is because here Data Wrapper really nicely put together 3 steps of why this leads to creating your chart. If you define your point, it can guide you through all of the following design decisions to emphasize that point, whether it's via color or annotations or even chart type. And it's really interesting here to know on the right that there's research on how accurate people can perceive information, like what Heather mentioned, a lot of psychological studies, from easier bar charts to good alignments on the top, to areas with colors or angles that are a little bit trickier to estimate. You might think that we always should strive for accurate estimate charts, but sometimes accurate comparison is actually not the goal or the point of your graph. Sometimes using non-standard graphs with a mix of colors and wacky shapes, like on the bottom, for example, Fatrika nicely did a graph on the menstrual cycle for Scientific American, actually shows the underlying pattern better and can help engage readers to hook them to care about the topic. That all goes to like knowing your point before you start. Next is really show the data. And that means to show the data that matters the most and not to show them all. So unnecessary elements like tags or tick marks can really be eliminated, as you can see in the scatter plot. And also use gray as your friend to fade out kind of the secondary elements. It's actually like gray is such a strong color. It can really help you highlight the point that you want to emphasize, right? And draw the audience to focus on the attention very quickly. Number 3 is to always annotate and design for accessibility. A lot of times when people create visuals, they forget about the text layer, but the text is just as important as the visual itself. It helps provide context, help your audience see what you see in the data, and also makes your graph more accessible. So for example, like for legends, number 1, you can actually label directly, which is better, so that people with colorblindness can know where you're labeling. And then number 2 is adding explainers and annotations to guide the audience and provide context. 3, write at the title like a newspaper headline. A lot of times when we write titles for graph, we just describe the data and forget to use it as a way to drive the point of what we want to make, and as a really effective way to really engage your audience. And last, most importantly, when you share graph, always remember alternative text, which really helps people that can't even see it to be able to understand your data viz using screen readers that will read the alternative text, which is easily found if you post visuals on Twitter, on Instagram, and multiple platforms now, so that more people can access the information that you want to share. And I provided some of the links on the resource sheet as well for best practices on that. Number 4 is to avoid the spaghetti chart. And sometimes it literally means like untangling the spaghetti. Like a lot of times we want to pack way too much stuff in a chart and forget we can break it into small multiples and make it easier to compare, like you see in the bottom examples. And finally, number 5, which I think is really the most important, is to know that data responsibility should be the core principle. Understand that a lot of times data viz, such as numbers and charts, are perceived by our audience as objective facts. But we all know that every step of the way where we decide to include or exclude, what we want to label, is all very subjective. Yet the final visual that we create can have a large influence on how people interpret data and make decisions, just like what Heather had said about the surgeon scorecards. Therefore, it's really important for us to understand our data is not perfect. It can suffer from our own biases and is amplified by our visuals. So constantly reminding ourselves to think carefully about how we present and use the data responsibly. This is definitely a really new space, and there's a lot of resource out there here. The Do Not Harm Guide from Urban Institute and Tableau gives really nice 10 tips. And this book, Data Feminism, has really great insights and examples, which I shared in the doc with the link that the full content of the book is actually freely online. Okay, now that we know kind of some fundamentals of principles of making great data viz, how do we turn these data viz into compelling stories? To me, translating data into journalism or storytelling is when data is no longer the secondary element in your work, like a chart in a report or a paper. Rather, it's kind of the main driver that shapes your story. Like for both of these graphs, my esteemed colleague Monica about the vaccine, or this work that I did highlighting the Ohia tree at sea collection effort in Hawaii. If you strip away the data, there's no story there. That's kind of the most amazing thing of data storytelling. So here, I think I would like to share some lessons from my projects and those of my talented colleagues of what I've learned in doing data storytelling. First of all, most important again, is to really know your audience and design for them. Here's a really great guide of using cognitive load as a way to navigate and understand where your audience is at and design the visual to suit your audience. It can be if they're subject experts or not, if they're accessing it from social media, which is really fast paced, or in print that allows them to explore slowly, or it can be cultural backgrounds, like where they're from, what type of aesthetics they resonate with, which is often overlooked right now at this space because data viz is still very prominently dominated by Western-centered narrative. And it's sometimes we forget that in different culture, aesthetics and narrative is perceived differently. So for example, on the subject of food, an academic, you can use jargons on the top here or Latin names and not include annotations, and peers would understand. But for example, on the graphic here in spice level, I'm from Taiwan, and where I'm from culturally, we love really cute mascots. We have mascots for like 7-Eleven for everything. We love bright contrast. And though it may challenge my modern design like principles that I've learned, but creating these very high contrast or bright colors and figures to kind of resonate with that audience is actually a better design for that community when we do communication in different areas. Or for example, this very great graph in Scientific American, it's in print. The audience are already interested in science. They just need a little bit of guidance to explore the data so that they know how to understand the graph. So really it's helpful to always define your audience and design for them. Sometimes it's helpful for me to actually like picture someone as my audience so that I feel more relatable as opposed to I'm designed just for like the universe or the people at large, such as like my mom, or like I often show my work to my husband. And like Heather said, it's really valuable to get feedback from those people as well to make sure they understand your graphic. Number 2 is always advocate for your audience and provide them with tools. A lot of times we have a tendency to dumb down our content because we think our audience can't grasp the complexity. Rather, I argue we should embrace complexity, but arm our audience with tools, such as this amazing graphic my colleague Manuel did about happiness. He created this amazing key just to like show, hey, like these 3 dimensions, how do you read this graph? And use clear annotations to guide and create a clear path for our audience to understand this complex graphic. Another is sometimes you can be playful with form, like to attract the audience's attention, but really know when. So here, my colleagues designed these really amazing forms to attract our audience to see like how commercial seeds variety has decreased over time with the complexity of diet. But then there are times where a simple bar chart is really the best. As communicators, we're delivering information. We're not like trying to show off our skills. For example, this graphic that I did about Silent Spring, about how farmland birds are declining more than all other birds. I explored various different ways to visualize this big data set on the left, as you can see, to try to showcase all of the birds and where they're standing. But in the end, I realized my point, going back to what is your point, right, is really showing the farmland birds and where they stand. So I realized that it's much more powerful to make my point visually most prominent using just a simple bar chart of where all these farmland birds stand in terms of their declining or increasing, and then have the other bird types as secondary elements to support where they stand inside of this ecosystem and this topic, which helps the audience really focus on the story and your point. And then number 4 is really provide context. A common way to categorize data is qualitative and quantitative. But in data viz, a lot of times we get too heavy on the quantitative data. Supporting quantitative with qualitative elements really help provide context. In the forums such as the same story, I use illustrations to show what do these birds actually look like, and it can balance the hard data with the warmth of illustration. Or here, Monica in the graphic about women in Congress, using graphic notes or photo ties in the qualitative element to support this quantitative data work. Another common category for data viz is explanatory storytelling and exploratory. A lot of times we think explanatory is like a static data set. We already have our conclusions. It's easy to explain it and has a story. Usually in digital is a scrollytelling, like the work that I did for vaccine for Sergo. For exploratory, a lot of times it's a dynamic data set for like COVID dashboards, for example, we're having audience examine and discover their own insight. And we often think, no, they don't have a story, they're just exploring. But I would argue that when done well, exploratory data also has a story. It's kind of a choose your own adventure story. And it's our goal to guide our target audience on this curated journey so that they understand the context. So I'm going to escape from this slide a bit and share here what I mean by that. So this was the scrollytelling that I did about explaining why Americans don't want to get vaccinated using psychobehavioral segmentation. So you can see we're doing scrollytelling using dynamic interactions of showing the data point and showing how demographic is not enough to understand why people don't want to get vaccines. So you can explore a little bit on your own. But on the other hand, this is a recent project I worked on maternal vulnerability, and it's kind of a more exploratory data set. However, I can curate these narration by first start off with toning down to where we stand, providing context of where does the US stand with the world, which we are doing terribly in terms of maternal vulnerability. Then with that knowledge, the audience can come in to understand, then why do we need this vulnerability index? Where are the US mothers vulnerable? They get to explore, but we provide context still to curate this story. Having that, we build on the knowledge of why are the mothers vulnerable, allowing them to explore, but providing the first default so that they can understand how to read this data viz. And then the impact of racism and exploring that in different race and ethnicity. It's an exploratory experience, but it still has a story. So yeah, feel free to explore more on this project. So I'm gonna come back. So here, a lot of times, like starting off to developing these narrative all starts with like sketching and storyboarding. And I really encourage anyone can do data viz just with pencil and paper. A lot of times I start these, you can see just with simple paper and pencil, kind of understanding the full narrative, and could even start here, like just with words, like what is my main point and where does these elements connect? Understanding that helps me become braver before I go into the digital tools of actually mocking up my narrative. And then finally, I think what is important is to also humanize your data. Understand your data are people, are beings, or real experiences too. A lot of times we forget to bring empathy and compassion in our design, and real lived experiences get reduced to data points or numbers and actually detach our audience to the true story and why they should care. So finding ways to design and connect numbers to what they really stand for can add a really impactful layer to data-driven storytelling that may inspire real action or emotionally connect with your audience. So here are some examples. I'm gonna share here again, but also in your doc. So for example, in the subject of COVID, Reuters graphics, instead of points, they use pictograms of people to really show these are actual humans that are taking a toll. So as these, instead of squares, they use illustrations to really show you the impact, which is really powerful. Another is these memories where we use actual stories for people to input what they're experiencing during the pandemic, along with the hard data. On a brighter note, this amazing project called Dear Data are two information designers where they did a project on how empowering everyone that like data are just everyday lived experiences. Everyone can collect data and start a data viz project, which is really fun and really empowering to see. Yeah, so let me come back again. So yeah, finally, for aspiring data viz piece, which I hope is everyone today after the talk, I would like to share some resources on how to get you started. For me personally, data storytelling really is powerful to share important stories to a wider audience in a more engaging and creative way. It often crosses language barriers, and through these projects, I can learn new things about the topic I report on and also improving my craft as a visual communicator. The amazing thing is really anyone can do it. It's a really supportive community from technical data scientists to designers to enthusiasts. And so if you want to get started on the doc, I have quite a few resource links and a running list that I continue to add for on the Excel sheet. But I would encourage to look for inspiration, follow these hashtags on Twitter and Instagram, subscribe to some newsletters. A lot of times I just get inspirations, taking screenshots for myself. And don't stop learning. These two books would really give you a great foundation of great principles and how to apply it to your work. And join the community. Data Viz Society, I highly encourage you to join. Provides a lot of great resource and connection. They have a conference, The Outlier, which started last year with a YouTube channel where you can see all of the recordings and also career panels for early starters. And finally, just start making things and also collaborate. So here's a new project that I'm showing that I'm working on with my collaborator, Julia. We want to start a series of projects on Taiwan stories because we both are from Taiwan. And this is a sketchboard for boba and how diverse there's all these different boba tea choices. We will be presenting in the Outlier Conference in 2022. So the conference topic that we're talking about is two heads are better than one, which I definitely think so. So sign up if you want to learn more, and hopefully we'll be able to finish the project before the talk and yeah, be able to hear other people to discuss. So yeah, that's all. Thank you so much, and keep in touch. I would love to see all the cool stuff y'all are making, and happy to answer any questions. Yeah, I'll turn it to Nico and Claire.
Well, thank you so much, Daisy. That was wonderful. So really, really grateful for all that advice and your inspirational work. So for everybody, if you're just joining us now, we have heard from Heather Lynch and Daisy Chung about how we can effectively visualize data. A recording of this webinar will be available at a later date for us to follow up on what was all discussed. So now we can move into some questions from our audience. So the first question that I would like to start tackling for both of you, and thank you so much for your time, is what is some top useful advice that you can give to students and researchers that want to improve their visual communication?
Well, I can say for students, I think that what I see as being barriers is that they don't see this as worth investing time into. And I really think that there is, it's one of the key things that I would invest time into as a student. It's learning how to write well. It's learning how to put together great visualizations. I think I would invest that time. And again, I think that when it comes to investing a little bit of money, but whether that be to hire a professional or to buy a little icon or to buy some software that you need, I think if it makes your life easier, the beauty of the final product will pay itself back. So I just invest in your own future, and you have more time than money. So maybe that's as a student where you should put your time. But I'm very curious what Daisy would think as well.
Yeah, so in addition to what Heather covered and like what I've mentioned in the talk, I feel like just start making stuff. A lot of times people are scared and don't know what kind of challenge, and like it doesn't have to be perfect. When you start making data visual, new challenges and questions will arise, and that will like inspire you to find the answers. A lot of times I feel like a great way to start if you want to improve your visual communication is start looking in the wild. Like back in the days, we like do newspaper cuts of like great things we want. Like now I just take screenshots of like New York Times or Data Wrapper or Washington Post or other great data viz folks. Then whenever you're stuck, you can just look at your folder of inspiration. It's like, oh yeah, I can do that type of visual. I can get you started earlier. And also don't feel like you're alone. And I would definitely recommend just like understanding the principle is helpful, and also understand that you don't have to do it all yourself. There's a reason why everybody has different specialized skills. Understanding what good visual communication can help you identify what kind of talent you want to collaborate with to realize your vision and communicate your research. Because for us that do data viz, we rely heavily on researchers to explain to us what's the point. And that really is a great synergy and collaboration, I think, that I've always really enjoyed. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very, very useful advice. So thank you so much. Another question that has been mentioned a lot, both in the registration forms and now here in the live webinar, is how can we accommodate visualization for colorblind people, for example, in terms of using the color palettes and also using more information in order to accommodate for that segment of our audience?
Well, I put one link in there to Color Brewer, that does allow you to select among colorblind friendly palettes, but I know that there are many kinds of color blindness, and so it may not sort of capture all of them. But certainly there are some great tools now that there weren't probably 20 years ago to see what your figure looks like with different kinds of color blindness, and you can yourself, it can show you what does this look like for people with all of the different kinds of color blindness, if that's not a problem that you have. So at least you can put yourself in their shoes and make sure that your plot is still accessible. But there are probably others that exist that Daisy would know about.
Yeah, I just shared a link in the chat, and on the Excel spreadsheet, I have some resources specifically about colorblind. But really, it's considering what other elements you can differentiate your data in addition to color. So not only just using color, can use shapes and positions and patterns in addition, so that there's another element that color is not the only. Color Oracle and SimDeltaSim, which is also shared in the link, are two really great testers that I use that can show you on your screen directly what it would look like in different color blindness scenarios. Resources like Data Wrapper often has a lot of blog posts about it, but I would also challenge people to think beyond colorblind and making your design accessible. Like accessibility in data viz or communication goes way beyond consideration of color blindness. Like people who are completely blind, 80% of the internet is not accessible for them because there's no alt text for them for screen readers. Or are you able to make your entire visual interactions like keyboard friendly? Like structuring that and getting resource for that is a really new but developing space. You can check, I think it's A11Y is like accessibility project that provides a lot of resource also in my link, because ultimately thinking about inclusive design in the beginning can really help make your data viz just good for everyone. Like inclusive design is good for even people who don't have those challenges. So that would be where I would check resources for.
And actually, just one more thing I'll mention is that sometimes it's not even just about being accessible, but sometimes printing color can be extremely expensive depending on the journal that you're working with. And so I always advise students, if you have a target journal in mind, try and design it in grayscale. Like if you can do it in grayscale, like Daisy mentioned, with shapes or sizes or shades, there's no need to bring in color if you don't need it. It's really hard to take a beautiful color figure and decide at the last minute you can't afford it, and then to try and reverse engineer a grayscale version. So I would first ask yourself if you even need color in the first place, because oftentimes that can be a big expense.
Yeah, that is actually a very, very good advice. So another question that we have, in actually tying up a lot of the information that I'm seeing right now on the Q&A session on this webinar, is what type of tips do you have to create a high quality visualization when we are under really time pressures, right? As we always are, right? So when we have to create something fast, but at the same time engaging and with a lot of information.
I guess I could jump first this time. Yeah, so for me, it'll be like 2 steps. First, like I would encourage to take a step back and really ask yourself, is this fast deadline realistic or is it arbitrary? Because I feel like a lot of times when we work, we become very reactive and set these arbitrary timelines where we have to meet, but there is value to having longer time so that you really understand the goal and the visualization. So I would take a step back and first ask, is it actually worth like the short timeline to compromise some of the more deep dive that you can do? Then if it is that we really have a short timeline, but we still want to create high quality viz, then I would always think for me, like what are the elements that I can compromise that won't hurt the effectiveness and what I want to communicate and the integrity of the data viz, such as really understanding the data and creating it responsibly, like knowing that I'm doing the data justice and really communicating and supporting it for my goal. Then the other stuff that I can compromise, maybe cut down on, such as how sophisticated the design should be. Maybe I can't draw a beautiful penguin next to this wonderful data viz. Instead, it has to be an icon, or like build on other people's work, like what Heather mentioned. There's amazing like data viz catalogs that helps you kickstart and you don't need to start from scratch. And a lot of times, a lot of spaces have already conventions of what type of data viz people use. So start from that. You don't have to start from scratch. So those would be the 2 tiers I recommend.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I think, for scientists, I think not starting from scratch is the biggest one. I don't think you are not, the galleries that are out there are open source, right? They're there to be reused. Your paper is not being judged on its originality. You are trying to communicate the science. So if you can take a code block from a a figure that's out there in a gallery to be reused and make it work for you, that's going to be so much faster than starting from scratch, and you're going to end up probably with a better product. So I think finding that thing that's like most of what you want is better than feeling like you have to do it all by yourself.
Yeah, of course, that is such great advice. So another related question to that is, what tips can you share about simplifying lots and lots of data when it may all seem relevant, right? Do you have any certain strategies? It is all dependent on your objective and your audience. How can you target those questions when you're actually designing and then producing your visualization?
Well, I like Daisy's comment about the multiple the multiple minis kind of thing, you know, that it might be that you have to sort of make different versions of the figure to really hone in on the thing that you want them to get from each of that, rather than feel like it has to be in one panel. And particularly online, if you want them to be able to select the country and then they can look at, you know, carbon over time in Argentina or Spain or something, that's certainly better than trying to put all the countries on at once. So I think that multiple minis setup really works well in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I definitely agree. A lot of times untangling that into different units is really helpful. And also when you look at all of the data, I would encourage like having like a good chunk of time for you to explore the data, like what is the most important of all the data and what are the secondary elements that we can tease out. Raw graph is a really great tool that I also shared on the link, that you can quickly see the pattern of all the data elements and see like what is the most interesting that can support your point, right? Support your thesis and design around that. And also like when you actually, a lot of times we do have to share all of the data set so that it becomes relevant. How do you use different designs, like using gray to parse out hierarchy, and really defining those hierarchies can really help guide and structure your data so that you're not like showing everything and like overwhelming the audience. And also just like, I would encourage, show your work to someone that has never seen it. Sometimes when we're too close to the data set, we tell ourselves everything is important, but it's not always the case. Like we become so attached to every single element. So just simply like having some fresh eye feedback can be really helpful too.
Yeah, Daisy and Heather, they're wonderful advice. So the last question before we reach to the end of this fantastic webinar is, what advice do you have to hire a graphic designer? And also what advice do you have when you are hired as a graphic designer?
I will leave that entirely to Daisy, but yes, because I want to know the answer to that as well. Yeah, what kind of information would you want to have from a scientist to even get started?
Yeah, that's a great question, and like really, I'm very happy that like someone would actually ask this question, because a lot of times that people feel like there's always just like a data viz button or something like that that can create a visual that you see it. But I feel like when you're thinking about hiring a professional, you're already kind of acknowledging the importance of data visualization or good visualization work. So that's like already a first step that I'm very happy that people are thinking about. What I feel like as a freelancer, when I do visual work, what is very helpful for me when someone hires and seek my expertise is to really understand the time frame that is needed to be budgeted for invisible work. So a lot of times the first part of doing research, understanding the project, understanding what is your main communicating message, for me takes up half of the time, but it's actually not visually translated in the work that we see it online. So budgeting that time and providing as much information to guide the graphic designer that you hire is super important. I always start off with my client with like just a kickoff meeting to get to know each other and also to get to know the project, so I can kind of understand how complex it is, and also be able to understand how much time I need to know to understand the research. So that part I would definitely budget in time-wise. And also understand that you need to pay for good, valuable work. Like it is good to know that investing in valuable work shows respect to the creator and also shows respect to the work that you're doing. Knowing that would really allow the collaboration to be both ways and allow ideas to flow both ways as well. In terms of from the other side, when I hire freelance illustrators or freelance workers that I collaborate with, one thing that I often tell myself and learn is to also honor and respect their workflow, because everybody has different ways of working as artists. Understanding their workflow from the beginning, like knowing when they're ready to show their work, when do they want to have check-in, and what kind of information structured they like. Do they want to read just all raw papers? Would they want bullet points? Do they want to show you work in progress, or they want to show you in the final stage with rounds of iteration? Is a really great way to set already that foundation of trust in the beginning, because with that trust, then all your collaborative work in the following process, whether it's a month or a week, can be a lot smoother and a lot more both directions. And that's where great work is created. Yeah, I hope that is helpful.
Yeah, that is such wonderful array of information. Thank you so much, both of you. So I am very and deeply grateful for having the opportunity of talking with you today. I will give the final words and the final minute to Claire just to finish and wrap up this webinar. Thank you so much to both of you, Heather and Daisy, just to be able to share this wonderful moment together. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. And I echo that thank you and that sentiment to Daisy, Heather, and Nico for sharing all these fantastic insights and incredible resources, I must say. So many awesome things were discussed, and so many questions are still sitting in our Q&A. So I have a feeling this won't be the first and only conversation that we all have with each other. There will definitely be some follow-ups going on. A recording of today's webinar will be available immediately on the All the Center's YouTube channel. Please feel free to head over there, and then I will also populate the description on that video with the resources that were shared in our chat today. I also invite you to keep an eye out too for our December webinar. This one will feature Adriana Bankston, who will give an introduction to science policy writing. So if anybody's interested, more information will become available later. And finally, I would like to give a huge thank you to the Kavli Foundation for their generous support to make these webinars possible. Thank you all so much for joining today and attending this webinar. Again, thank you, Nico, Heather, and Daisy for sharing your insights. The chat is absolutely blowing up right now, sharing the audience's sentiment. You all did such a wonderful and incredible job. And with that, I hope everybody has a great rest of their week, and we will see everybody again soon.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all for the great questions. And thanks, Claire, for hosting.
Thank you so much. I'll see you guys soon.